Good evening. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History talk, presented in partnership with the New York Immigration Coalition. For sure, on January 20th, anyone thinking about immigration joined in a collective sigh of relief. And yet, those yets and a bunch of whys and a few hows are what will be unpacked tonight with what is truly an extraordinary panel. Before I introduce them, let me briefly introduce myself and say a word about the Center for Brooklyn History and the New York Immigration Coalition. My name is Masha Eli. I am the Director of Programs at the Center, which is a part of the Brooklyn Public Library. In addition to stewarding the most extensive collection of Brooklyn history in the world, and in addition to our research and education activities, every week the Center for Brooklyn History offers free public programs like this one through Brooklyn Public Library's programming arm, BPL Presents. In the next few weeks, for instance, we're welcoming Roxane Gay, Naomi Klein, Toshi Reagan, and many more. I hope you visit the Brooklyn Public Library's website, find BPL Presents, and explore what's coming up. We are honored to have as our partners tonight the New York Immigration Coalition, the nation's largest immigrant rights coalition with over 200 members representing immigrants and refugee rights groups throughout New York State. NYIC works day after day to protect and advance the rights of immigrant communities. To learn more, visit their website at nyIC.org. I also want to share two important brief notes. First, a number of tonight's speakers have written books related to this subject. Please check the chat for a link to purchase these books locally at the community bookstore in Brooklyn. And finally, I want to invite all of you to share your questions during the program. Simply type them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And now it is my great pleasure to welcome tonight's moderator, and he in turn will introduce the panel. John Washington is a journalist, translator, and activist. He is also an editor for the English language newsletter of the Salvadoran investigative newspaper El Faro. His own first book, The Dispossessed, published last year, is a story of one man's search for safety in the United States and a historical exploration of the ancient origins of asylum. A regular contributor to the Nation and The Intercept, his most recent article revealed how guards at ICE detention centers are threatening to expose detainees to COVID to get them to submit to their deportations. John, thank you for leading this conversation. Thank all of you behind the screen here for joining this discussion. And I turn it now over to you.
Hello, thank you so much, Marcia. And thanks to the Center for Brooklyn History and New York Immigration Coalition. Really an honor to be in conversation here tonight. I'm going to start with this brief introductions of each of our panelists. I will start with Masha Gessen, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker, author of multiple books, most recently Surviving Autocracy, which was published last year, but I would say is very much still relevant today, post January 20. They're also the author of The Future's History, which won the National Book Award in 2017. And they are someone who I turn to regularly for some of the most cutting, brilliant, critical, eye-opening thoughts and analysis of sort of everything or anything. And I think that maybe eye-opening is even putting it lightly. I think of it sometimes as like LASIK surgery for just looking at current events. So honored to be in touch with you, Masha.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you. Next, we have Ayad Akhtar, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright and novelist, and author most recently of the provocative, acerbic, and incredibly engaging homeland elegies. And, I think that I just finished this book very recently, and I think that not very many books are so thoughtful and so essayistic at times, and yet at the same time, so incredibly gripping and page-turning. Ayad's range is at once both polymathic and yet keeps returning to these central questions of belonging and the problems of othering in contemporary American society. And Ayad, it's just an honor to be in conversation tonight. So thanks so much.
I'm so honored to be here as well. Thank you.
Great. And Mae Ngai is the Lung Family Professor of Asian American Studies and a Professor of History at Columbia University. She is the author of Impossible Subjects and The Lucky Ones, One Family and the Extraordinary Invention of Chinese America. And Impossible Subjects, I'll say, should be required reading for anyone who ever utters the phrase, a nation of immigrants. The book describes, I think, among 1,000 revelatory observations, one that I picked up on as I was glancing through it earlier today. Mae describes undocumented persons as those whose presence is a social reality, yet a legal impossibility. And that's the sort of conundrum that Mae does such a wonderful and excavatory job like unpacking it. And I'm so pleased that you're here to help us unpack a number of other conundrums tonight.
Thank you, John. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be on this panel with so many august speakers.
And we also have Anu Joshi, who is the Vice President of Policy at New York Immigration Coalition. And in her role, Anu oversees the coalition's work on immigrant integration and immigrant rights policy. For over a decade, Anu has been fighting for immigrant rights, previously working with the American Immigration Lawyers Association, or AILA. And I would say is one of the smartest and most articulate practitioners I've come across. I listened last week to a panel you were on. I mentioned this before, Anu, and I just kept on wanting to thank you for both boiling down and expanding on so many incipient thoughts that I think I and so many people are having right now in terms of immigration in this transition period. So again, it's just an absolute pleasure to be here in conversation tonight.
Definitely, I'm really excited to be here.
Great. So here we are. We survived, but clearly not everyone did, the Trump administration. And that's a fact that I think is important to keep in mind. And what we haven't survived or we haven't gotten through is the underlying forces that engendered the Trump administration. I will admit, as Masha said on January 20th, or maybe a couple of days after, I also sort of let myself breathe a sigh of relief. But I know that we're very much not out of the woods. Masha, you also mentioned the last article I wrote about people being threatened by being exposed to COVID if they didn't submit to their deportation. That happened, under Biden's watch, on Biden's watch. So we are not out of the woods, nor did Trump drag us into the woods. We have been in the woods for a long time. Obama before that, many people are familiar with the 3 million deportations. He also militarized the border. And then Bush before that, erecting hundreds of miles of walls. And, people who voted for that wall construction are the same people who now decry it. And before Bush, we had Clinton and Reagan. You can go back and back and back. And yet, last week, one of the many executive orders that has been issued by Biden on immigration, it was a very long title, but included in that title was the phrase, quote, "restoring faith in our legal immigration systems." And I wonder about that cognitive dissonance. And I want to start by asking our panelists to reflect a little bit on narrative and the stories that we tell about immigration. I think we're all storytellers one way or another here tonight. And I wonder what stories we mistell or should be telling in terms of immigration. How do we more honestly, truthfully, or get to the reality, the lived reality of what is going on in immigration, especially when all of these things, all of this is coming at us and there's so much change. I'd like to start with Mae. I mean, I mentioned the in my intro about this what you do in your research on the idea of a nation of immigrants. And I'd love to hear you expand on that, or just all of what's going on right now and how we're telling the story of immigration today.
Okay, thank you. Well, it's a really provocative way that you started. And I want to push back a little bit. I don't think it's all been the same. I think we went from a kind of system under that goes back to the 1960s, which I would call a kind of narrative and system of liberal nationalism, in which you have the contradiction of a claim that people are welcome and included, and yet you have fairly strict restrictions which mean that many people cannot come under the legal system. So you have a built-in limits on who can be included. That's often obscured by things like numbers or rhetoric, or saying all nations are equal, which means that Mexico has the same limit of visas as New Zealand, et cetera, et cetera. So, so I think what we've been living under before Trump was what I would call a system of liberal nationalism, which was restrictive and protectionist in many ways. But under Trump, we had something different. We had authoritarianism, and we had a naked nativism that we have not had since what people call the tribal 20s. And it was, and I've been writing something about Trump's immigration policies under Trump. And I really think that, we have to reckon with how this kind of naked racism and nativism under Trump was really a handmaiden to fascism. When you start saying these people are other and they don't belong, and the immigrants are the easiest to pick on, because they look different, and because we have a legal system that allows us to treat them differently, right? That and our domestic others of centuries are African Americans, right? Once you start picking on people, these people do not belong, and you do it with such naked racism, I think that is what opens the door to authoritarianism. Now, Masha's the expert on this here, and she can speak more about that. But I think that, what we saw under Trump was not just more of the same. I mean, yes, Obama did separate families, but not in the same way that Trump did, not wantonly and not as cruelly as deterrence. So I think that what we have under Trump was really fascistic. And what we have to do now under Biden is not just go back to the same liberal nationalist paradigm, because that is also has many problems in it. But I am hopeful. Maybe later we can talk about not just his executive orders, but the immigration bill that he's proposing, which I think we don't have the bill. We don't know other than the vague outlines, but I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. And I can see the imprint of immigrant activists over the last 12 years. I can see the imprint of their activism in that bill. So anyway, so we'll save that for later. But I think we still have a lot of fighting to do, but I think we have barely dodged a bullet with Trump. And I'll just stop there for now. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mae. Yeah, I would love to hear Masha who take it from here. You've written quite a lot about the role of the media and the rise of autocracy, and I wonder how you see immigration, like what role immigration plays in autocratic regimes or the rise of autocracies, and how the media and narrative storytelling or narrative descriptions of it play a role in combating it or enabling it.
Thank you, John. And I'm so glad that you were starting with the question of narrative, because I think that is the question. I think when we talk about Trump, whether we're talking about immigration or whether we're talking about anything else, really, right? There are these two competing stories that we tell. One is that Trump is unlike anything that came before. That that he is anomalous, that he is, that he may have come from outer space or from the Russians, and that he's really he's really a break with America as we knew it. And the other story, I think, much less common, is sort of no, he was another Republican president. And the preconditions for Trump were there before there was any Trump. He wasn't necessarily predetermined, but he certainly was possible. And we know this because he happened, but also because we can actually identify so many of the factors that made him possible. And I think the challenge actually is to tell both of those stories at the same time. Because if we only tell the first story, then that creates this illusion that we can go back to a pre-Trump normal, which May referred to, right? And if we only tell the second story, then it really ignores the absolute catastrophe and trauma that we lived through for the last 4 years. And I think that nowhere it's probably as evident as with immigration, because I think that having lived through the separation of families, having lived through children in cages, and I say this even though none of us here in this virtual room actually lived through children in cages, but every person in this country who knew about it, who saw the media coverage, is in some way complicit and in some way traumatized by it, right? And that is unlike anything that we have lived through in this country before. And yet so many of the things that Trump was building on, including the very detention centers that he used, the system for deportations, the militarized border, were preconditions that were there before there was a Trump. And also, I'm really interested in what May said, and I'd love to hear more about it, because and I think, May, you're much more the expert on this than I am, but I thought that the narrative had been, narrative and policies, right, had been shifting since at least the 1990s. The sort of, I think there was if in the 80s we had restrictive immigration policies that were couched in a rhetoric of, we want immigrants, we want legal immigrants, but we have to have all sorts of laws that protect this country, right? There was this sort of built-in contradiction based on this idea that was never, unfortunately, questioned, that we somehow have the right to decide who gets in and who doesn't in this land that we have colonized. I think that starting in the 90s, the sort of we want immigrants part of that story started fading away, right? And certainly, especially since 9/11, the protectionist part of the story, both in policy and in rhetoric, has been much more pronounced. And I think that's also part of what made Trump possible and made his war on immigrants such an obvious way of sort of announcing and consolidating his power, especially in the first 2 years of the administration.
Thanks, Masha. Yeah, like really interesting ideas already. I'd love to get Ayad to reflect on this a little bit. I wonder too about the shift in the narrative from the 90s. And Mae, I would love if you want to jump in at some point to correct us, because you're by far the expert here. But like,
I'll wait till after everybody's spoken, and we'll come back to it.
Okay.
I don't want to hog the.
Thank you. So like the shift from immigration control to immigration/protectionism, like literal protectionism, after the first World Trade Center attack in the 90s and the 1996, subsequent 1996 immigration law. And then of course, as you mentioned, Masha, after 9/11, really brought the idea, tied the idea of protecting the homeland from not only supposedly a terrorist, but immigrants. And I think that's something that you deal with in a really interesting way, Ayad, in your work. And I wonder if you could chime in. Thank you.
Sure. So yeah, the subject of my most recent book really is, in some parts, at least one of the dominant stories is the relationship of my parents to this country, who, both of them were doctors, and they came over on a program that gave them plane tickets, visas, jobs, and apartment rentals, subsidized apartment rentals, because they were both doctors, and the the U.S. government was trying to get engineering and medical talent to come to the country, scientific talent to come to the country. So they came in the mid 60s, not only welcome, but solicited. And then after, certainly after 9/11, things changed, and I, my own parents' relationship to this country changed, in part because of their sort of dawning realization, or at least my father's dawning realization, perhaps, that he wasn't as American as he maybe wanted to be, or hoped that he would become someday, that there was some part of his identity that was always tied to the fact that he had grown up somewhere else. And that the idea of America was not enough to sustain the more organic need for a kind of belonging that sustained him differently. And my mother was, at odds at different points with the country that she had adopted as her home, but felt welcome until 9/11, and then after 9/11 did not feel welcome at all, to the point that as she got much older, wouldn't really even leave the house. She just felt besieged by the gazes of her neighbors, if you will. So yeah, there was a big shift, and my family lived that shift out. In many ways, it's a story I try to tell. There isn't a single strand of that story. There are many different aspects of it, at least within my family. So, and again, I put my family in quotes only because the book I wrote is a novel, because I concoct so much of it, but it is substantially based on so many things that did happen. So.
Thank you, Ayad. And I wonder, Anu, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. We're talking about like a big picture narrative here. And I think one element that could be forgotten is that narrative is crucially important on the individual basis as well. This is something I really learned in researching my book about asylum, that like it really is like what asylum seekers need to do is spin a convincing narrative, and it needs to be, show their credibility, and needs to be engaging enough that the judge buys it. It's like Scheherazade telling the story to stay alive or something. And I wonder, in your role as a practitioner, how you see the importance of narrative in individual cases, and then also, again, if you want to reflect on the bigger picture as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it all relates back to each other. The larger narrative, right, is just a collection of the individual stories that are being told. And I want to emphasize this idea that while Trump really weaponized an immigration enforcement system to really try to change the very nature of our immigration system, he was able to do that because we've had decades of investment from both parties in an out of control immigration enforcement system. And it really ramped up post 9/11. But as you mentioned, John, we saw a horribly racist anti-immigrant bill passed in 1996 that really, set us on a path of treating immigrants like criminals rather than as members of our community and as trying to reunite with their families and just live full, happy lives. And I really want to, uplift, President Obama was responsible for expanding family detention in 2014. He didn't separate families, but he put mothers and their babies in jail together, right? So, it was nowhere near the level that Trump took it to. And so that is critically important. But I think it's important also to remember that, unfortunately, we've seen both sides of the aisle really buy into this idea that in order to be successful, in order to really move the needle on this issue, we have to make some sort of investment in keeping families apart or quote unquote securing our border. So I just want to highlight that. On the other hand, under President Trump, we saw immigration to this country almost cut in half over the 4 years. And so that will have a profound impact on all of us moving forward and what that means for who we are and, family members who have lost the opportunity. There are harms that cannot be undone. On his first day in office, President Biden signed a repeal of the Muslim ban, and that was huge. It was a huge campaign promise he had made, and it was one of President Trump's first actions, his most odious, one of his most odious actions. But there were real harms that happened in those 4 years that cannot be undone. And, we really need to take a moment to reckon with that, I think. And then, I just want to, on the other side of that coin, we are in Black History Month. We saw President Biden sign an executive order on the first day, instituting a moratorium on deportations. And we have already seen plane loads of Haitians deported to a country that is not safe for their return, not given a chance, their right to apply for asylum in this country, not able to even have a chance to tell their story, right? So, stripped of that chance. And that's happening right now. Planes are taking off. And so it's hard. It's hard because the community, immigrant community, has suffered so much in the last 4 years, but we have to remember that it wasn't all, roses beforehand, and that there is still so much work to be done to reckon with what happened. And then the last thing I want to say, though, to kind of end on, an optimist note, Mae is totally right. In the bill that President Biden, has said that he's going to put forward, I just want to uplift one small thing. It includes a chance to return home for people who were deported under the Trump administration. We have never seen that in any Democratic bill that's been put forward, right? Like the chance for people to apply for a status after they've been deported. And that's huge. And that was the direct result of organizing and political pressure and an election, frankly, where immigrant communities came out in large numbers. So that was an incredible thing to see. It's a long ways away from being law, but the fact that it was even included, it really made me happy.
Can I jump in here? And just pick up on that and go back to this question that Masha raised about the 90s. I do think the 90s, there was a turning point. And I think in two major ways. One was the 96 laws that Anu just referenced, which were punitive. It was nothing else but punitive to legal immigrants, not to mention the undocumented. And the other was the militarization of the border, which really took off in the 90s. And the border, the militarization of the border was a kind of really, in some ways it was a consequence of the 1986 reform bill, in which legalization was passed and the compromise was border security. And that was a terrible deal. And it was the only thing possible at the time. I don't know that it could have been different if, you know, the liberals and the left had struggled longer. I mean, as it was, that bill took 6 or 7 years to pass. But that idea that we can only have comprehensive reform if we yoke legalization to border security is what we've been saddled with. It's the albatross that we have had since 1986. And it is directly responsible for the ramping up of the borders, militarization of the border. And going back to Biden's bill, he broke that tie. He broke that connection between legalization and border security. And I don't know if it's going to make it through Congress, but that is huge. And that is, and I have, you know, I mean, I know activists, I support them. I have so much respect for the people in the trenches. You know, I mean, I just kind of read books and think about things. So I have all the respect in the world for the activists. And I have heard them say, we're not going to do that again. We are not going to sacrifice. We're not going to make that compromise again. And you can see it in that bill. So we'll have to see what happens. But I do think that, so the other point I want to make apropos of all this is what was important about 86 and then the 90s. It was about the so-called illegals, the undocumented. All of that was code for Latinos. You know, in the 80s, it was still perhaps impolitic to be openly racist. So illegal became the code for brown people, keep the brown people out. And we know that the undocumented are not just Latinos. We know that a lot of people who suffer under the immigration system are not just from Latin America. But that was the narrative that drove the whole train. And it was the thing that conservatives used to get moderates to back this nativist agenda, in my view. And so I think that what you saw under Trump was all of that just kind of burst wide open. We don't even have to talk about documented versus undocumented. We're just against everybody from a shithole country, right? It was all out there. And the only immigrants we want are the Norwegians, which is a joke, because why would anybody in Norway want to come to the United States where they'll make less money and not, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that what you saw in the 90s was this backlash against a growing brown population in the United States. And then after 9/11, that was compounded with the ramping up of Islamophobia and policies against people from Muslim countries. And so I think that a lot of this comes down to a kind of racial politics. You know, why is it that there's so many undocumented Mexicans and Latinos? It's because the 1965, the great liberal reform said we're going to treat every country equally. So we're going to have a quota of 20,000 on Mexico, just like we have the same number on Belgium or whatever. And that's why you have so many people coming without papers. And so I think it was really interesting that also the timeline to citizenship under the new Biden plan, which is fairly generous. I mean, it could be better, but it's 8 years. Whereas in the last Gang of 8 bill, it was 15. And when I thought about that back at 15, I was like, you know, that's a generation of voters. That's what that's all about. And so I think a lot of what this is about is what you see in the Trump era politics of white grievance against a country that's increasingly a country of people of color.
Thank you, Mae. I wonder about the the Biden bill myself a lot. And I worry, and I know a lot of people in activist communities and elsewhere worry about what happens when you put a more toothsome face on a system that is in place. And you know, we have a long way to go before potentially a Biden bill passes. There was a really, I think, interesting and kind of scary term I picked up from an article by Sarah Stillman the other week called she put it, the way she put it was regulatory dark matter. It's this idea that there's this infrastructural, like very almost like arcane system of rules that are in place and have been put in place by Trump and others before him that have momentum, and they have like these channeling of the way that people are treated. And so I wonder like how maybe we could turn again to Masha, and I wonder how, as we see this more you know, bright and smiley face on a system that still is doing these things like sending back Haitians or threatening to expose people to COVID, how do we continue to push or continue to expose, and like what is the role of a journalist as you see as we move forward?
That's a harder question than it ought to be, because I don't really know the answer, right? There were a number of us, obviously during the Trump years, who were trying to write about immigration, writing about immigration. You just mentioned Sarah Stillman, John Blitzer has been doing amazing work at the New Yorker, but there's like there was a sense that you couldn't write faster than the horror became normalized. And also it's very difficult to write about people who many readers of the New Yorker perceive as other and get any reader interest. You know, I had a couple of reported columns from Tijuana very early on in the Trump presidency. And, you know, I could just see that, like, when I was going on about how horrible Trump was, sort of in more general terms, my columns were viral all the time and were incredibly popular. And reported columns from Tijuana weren't just particularly interesting to readers of the New Yorker, you know. And maybe they weren't great columns. There's I mean, again, there's been great journalism, great reporting that my colleagues have done who are really covering this issue full time, like Sarah and John. But I think there needs to the project is bigger than journalism, right? The sort of the problem of changing the ways in which we talk about immigration, changing the language that we use to talk about immigration, of changing the assumptions that we operate with when we're talking about immigration. You know, that just journalists are not going to be able to do it. We need the fiction writers like Ayad. We need, but we also need political leadership, right? It's right at the moment, any politician, any member of Congress who uses the phrase "open borders" will use it as a smear, right? That's a way to discredit any political project, is to call it an open borders project. It's like the contemporary equivalent of the Red Scare, right? Like, how do we change that kind of narrative? And that's, you know, that's a political project that involves the media and writers, but it's not just about how we cover the atrocities.
Thanks, Masha. Ayad, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, we're talking about it's not just the role of journalists, but of novelists and other artists to humanize, or what is the role that's important and need to be taken here?
I mean, it's a good question. I feel probably above my pay grade to answer it in any kind of ultimate terms, but I can answer it on my terms, which is to say that just continuing to tell stories, to tell stories of what actually, American identity is a hybrid phenomenon. There is no such thing as, there isn't any kind of like essential American identity. And but I don't know that I don't know that my imagination is animated by the task or the job of performing that function. I think I'm, motivated to tell great stories about, usually about the sorts of people that I know, that I grew up with. And so I think in the process of doing that, hopefully, every now and then a writer like myself, writing fiction or writing for the movies or writing for the theater, will stumble on a character that has a wider resonance for people. And people will identify with the experience that that person has had. And we'll see that as a viable template for a more universal articulation of any number of things: love, greed, hate, American identity, whatever. And that process, that's just an ongoing process that's going to require time. And something Mae had said earlier, which is that the country's changing, and inevitably the stories that we tell about our country are going to change, and there's going to be pushback. And so there's going to be stories about the pushback. I feel, for example, a book that I wrote, I couldn't have imagined even 3 or 4 years ago it being as welcomed as warmly as it has been. I think something is changing. I think people are seeing in the stories of so-called others their own experience in ways that maybe before they thought those stories were of, perhaps entertaining or anthropological interest, but it didn't necessarily touch them where they lived and breathed. And I think increasingly people are feeling that stories about people who are not like them are touching them where they live and breathe.
Thanks, Ayad. I'd love to turn to you, Anu, and to hear your thoughts on any of this. But also, there's, we're talking a bit about pushback and like how we push back as artists or writers or historians or practitioners. I wonder, too, it's something you mentioned in the panel I touched on earlier, is about pushback at a more local level, at a state level, which I think is something that's often overlooked. We often think about it in like these big macro terms of like changing comprehensive immigration reform is like the catchword, which is such a huge, like practically omnibus juggernaut that doesn't get moving or crushes people as it does. And I know Mae has written about this as well. Some of the early, not only like the way that states have resisted federal immigration law, certainly under Trump, New York and Hawaii, California, et cetera, suing the state or suing the government. Under Obama, of course, Texas, we already see it under Biden with Texas stopping the partial moratorium. But then the origins of federal immigration law started at the state level, which Mae has written about some. And I wonder about state level. New York's Home Act is a really interesting bill. I think that there's also, just even at a smaller level, perhaps, like what is the importance of not just talking these big terms, but like community resistance, mutual aid, getting to know your neighbors, ice out of the community, things like that. Do you find that plays a pretty, what role do you think it plays in all of this as we move forward, to push Biden or to push back against what we have?
Yeah, I mean, speaking as a New Yorker, I know that in order to make real lasting change, we will have to make changes at the state level, right? That's how we can really ensure that our immigrant communities can not only survive, but that they can really thrive and be, live whole lives. And we know that the far right, the anti-immigrant movement in the country has been doing this really well and has long understood the importance of states as testing grounds for longer term projects. I mean, when President Obama was in office, and we had small limited relief that he offered through DACA or through prosecutorial discretion, and we saw the states react, right? Starting with Arizona and SB 1070 and the Show Me Your Papers law, which was quickly copycatted in 5 other states successfully, 15 other states attempted. And that was written by one think tank with cooperation from a private prison that detains immigrants, right? So the left, the progressive immigrant rights movement needs to get better at figuring out, okay, how do we use our states to really push a protective agenda for immigrant communities? And I think about, we just did a project with a counterpart in California. New York and California combined have a third of all of the immigrants in the country. So when we make policy changes in our two states, it has a real potential to impact, on a national level. The other thing I just wanted to note, to a point that Mae made a few minutes ago, is that while we have seen this coupling, like you said, this behemoth idea of what is comprehensive immigration reform, and it started with the amnesty bill in the 1980s, coupling border security with legalization. But since then, we've only gotten the enforcement money. So it hasn't actually been coupled. We have seen our spending on immigration enforcement just since 2003 with the creation of DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, and border protection. Triple. We now spend $25 billion on immigration enforcement. And that's a story that has to be told, right? Because that is us as a country making a decision about where our priorities lie. Investing in keeping people out rather than keeping people whole here. So, I think altogether, like, we understand the importance of states, but we also know that states can't give people citizenship. It's just that's the reality. And there are certain rights that will forever be cut off from people until we're able to change that. So I think it's a both and scenario. And just as one example, the NYC is working on a campaign right now, the New York for All Act, which New York is actually far behind our sisters in Washington State and California and Illinois and Massachusetts. And this bill would prohibit any state resources, state employees, municipal, county, city employees from colluding with immigration enforcement. Right now, we see it all the time in Western New York, where a police officer, a local law enforcement will pull someone over and then call Border Patrol, right? And that is not how we should be spending our New York resources to separate families. And so there's so many things that we still need to do at the state level that we're so far behind. And so, there's just a lot of work to be done.
If I can just add to that,
Please.
I think that's a great way to put it. It's both and I think one of the things that is really important at the local level, both the local and the state level, is how our community, we can protect our communities. Trump's whole thing about the sanctuary cities breaking the law, actually it's the other way around. The Constitution prohibits the federal government from coercing states and localities into enforcing federal laws. And I think we saw that as awful as ICE is, ICE, as much money that's poured into enforcement, they do not have the capacity to apprehend and deport 10 million people. And the fact that cities and counties and states refuse to cooperate with ICE in the notorious detainer policy, Trump's deportation figures are actually lower than Obama's. It's interesting. So, and I'm sure there's other reasons for that as well. But I think that, to the extent that our communities can protect people and give them space, at least to survive, right, and not feel threatened all the time, and to nurture the arts, the creative energies in our communities. And I think maybe that's one reason why New Yorkers tend to be, not all New Yorkers, but New Yorkers tend to be more pro-immigration, because we see what vibrancy immigrants bring to our city's cultural life, as well as our, culinary lives and our fashion lives and our theatrical lives. We live in, I think, I think New York's the greatest city because everybody's here, and people suffer. That's true, and there's a lot of struggle that goes on. But I think, you know, the task of narrative, I guess, overall is to show how immigration brings not just diversity in some kind of banal way, but it brings vibrancy and life into our culture, right? So I think it's a really complicated question, you know, John, that you've posed, and I think Masha, you know, was right to say that, you know, I think at the meta level, how do you change the narrative? That's, you know, I think we just have to all do our part of it, and hope that it adds up, because I don't think there's some master plan for changing the narrative. I think we just have to change our piece of the narrative, and hopefully our voices will add up. And, you know, the thing about, I'll just end on this note, the thing about the reaction and of racism against the growing Latino population. I mean, that's a reaction to a demographic trend that is not going to go away. But I think what we've also seen is demography is not destiny, right? It's also about politics. And so we have a lot of work to do to kind of nurture a future that includes everybody.
Thank you, Mae. And feel free, any of panelists, to jump on anything we've discussed here already. But I do want to turn to some questions. As I ask a couple of these audience questions, I'd like to throw one extra in that is a quick one. You know, given especially that we are being sponsored by the Center of Brooklyn History, I thought it would be interesting to hear y'all give some recommendations. I'd like to give attendees like a practical takeaway of a book or a writer that you recommend that people could turn to. I've sort of already recommended all of your books, so I sort of get away with it, but I'm going to add one more on here, and it is Kelly Little Hernandez's Migra! ! Which is a history of the U.S. Border Patrol, and I think does a fantastic job of not only recounting the exact history, but talking about the origins of what compelled or impelled the creation of the Border Patrol. And it's often overlooked and misunderstood. So if y'all, as you answer these couple last questions from the audience, if you want to throw out a recommendation as well, that would be great. Here is a tough one. So here we are. I lost it for a second. I haven't heard anyone address what the immigration policy should actually be. And this is from Lawrence Maylander. How do we choose who gets in? Criminals are not welcome, right? Can we let every non-criminal in? Is the question. So if anyone wants to take a stab at that.
So I'm going to start by by saying something that everybody can contradict and take down, I hope. You know, I don't. I think that's a really interesting and fundamental question, because it assumes that we have the right, like the moral right, to create immigration policy, which I think is a very problematic premise, right? And I think that it's a fundamentally undemocratic premise. Democracy is the government of the governed. In a way, and certainly as we have seen in the last 4 years, people who are trying to enter this country or are here without what this country considers to be proper legal documents, or are here on some sort of contingent status, are governed in the extreme, right? Are governed to a greater extent than most people who have not left this country since being born. And so, you know, we have this basic moral problem of democracy, which is that if a democracy polices its borders, that goes against its ideals as a democracy. And from that, I think a lot of things flow, you know, which is that I think immigration policy should be minimal. I think that immigration enforcement is problematic by definition, that, and that we should even question sort of the very mild ways of talking about immigration that pass for good ways of talking about immigration. You know, the sort of the deserving immigrant narrative, the the good immigrant, the economic interest narrative, the or the, you know, the sort of the variation on the economic interest narrative, which is that because we have an economic interest in immigration, we also have an interest in families coming here with immigrants, because that also bolsters the economy and makes the, you know, the immigrant more productive, right? Like, all of those are awful. And I think that when we talk about immigration policy, we have to basically bear in mind that we're talking about what is perhaps a necessary, although I'd question it, but certainly an evil, right? And I'll stop there.
I'll chime in. I agree that that it's a fundamentally illiberal aspect of liberalism to say that everybody's equal except we get to say who is inside the circle of the liberal society. And I think the other thing that's very hard for Americans to think about is, I mean, the kind of the image that many people have is that, you know, we're the greatest country in the world, and, you know, everybody else in the world is just clamoring to get in, and there are hordes of them, and all they're going to do is drag us down. But it starts with this premise that, you know, we're the most wonderful place that everybody else wants to come to. Now, I think there are many good things about living in this country. I don't deny that. But I think we have to see it as a position of privilege in a world where resources are distributed in fantastically unequal ways. And so for people who are in very poor areas and people who don't have those privileges, we have to think about our position. And if we want a more equal world, in a world where things were distributed more justly or more equally, maybe not so many people would want to leave their country. Maybe they would choose to stay. And you know, I mean, there are people who just want to go somewhere else because they're adventurous or they have a certain career they want to pursue. But many people, I think, you know, if all things being equal, they would maybe want to stay. And so, you know, one thing that's going back to the Biden bill, there's this little teaser in it that they're going to try to address conditions, you know, in Central America to make it less of a push factor, right, and why people want to leave. But I think for Americans to confront the privileged position we have in the world is something that's very hard to do. It's right up there with the illiberal part of having a liberal society or the anti-democratic part of a democracy. And so I think those are two really big moral challenges we have to reckon with if we're going to have an honest conversation about immigration. Now, that being said, on a practical level, you know, there are many things that could be said to have a better system. For example, why not have an open border? Why not let the labor market decide, you know, be the factor in terms of people who come? I mean, at the end of the 19th century, the early 20th century, we had an open border, more or less. I mean, it wasn't open for Chinese or other Asians, but for Europeans, it was normatively open. And people came because there was an industrial revolution going on, and there were jobs, and there were reasons in their home countries where, the countryside was getting eaten up by capitalist relations or whatever, these kinds of things. There was huge transfer. I mean, there was a percentage of population. There were more people who came in the early 20th century than today. And there was no limit on the number of people who came. And the number of people who came was basically determined by a global labor market. And so I'm not a free market person by any stretch, but I think it's curious that in immigration, we have a system that is completely indifferent to the labor market, completely indifferent to it. In fact, it wants nothing to do with it. So, so if you said, well, if you just had an open border and you let labor conditions determine basically the volume and direction and destination of people who came, what would happen? I don't think 100 million people would just show up. I just don't think that would happen. I mean, as in many things, maybe at a very large scale of things might tend to even out. I don't know. I mean, right now Mexico has a net zero migration to the United States. What we have at the southern border is a refugee crisis, an asylum crisis. It's not Mexicans at the border right now. Why is that? Because the standard of living in Mexico has gone up and the birth rate has gone down. And there are also not so many great jobs here for Mexicans. And so those are all factors. It really has something to do with enforcement, but it's not mostly because of enforcement. So anyway, I think that, as much as we get smeared as open borderists, I think it's actually a conversation that we can have now that we probably couldn't have had 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
Thanks, Mae and Masha. To throw out a couple numbers as we turn to Ayad and Anu, there was a poll taken a few years ago, and I can't remember the exact statistic now, but it was how many people would move to the United States if you could, and it was taken internationally. And it was a very large number. It was dozens of millions of people, but there was the question is, could they actually get here? Which, and is a very serious question. And this was also before Trump, before coronavirus, etc. The other number that I think is important to keep in mind is that the projections right now are that by 2050, because of the climate crisis, there will be in the ballpark of 250 million to 500 million displaced people. So, I mean, I completely agree with you, Masha, that I don't see how we have the moral right to restrict immigration. But maybe I wonder if we have or to decide who gets to let in and who doesn't. But that is the system we have right now. And maybe I wonder if we have the moral duty to dismantle that, if you think, or just it's going to be a question that will be addressed as we move forward in coming decades for those reasons I just mentioned. And I wonder, Masha, so I mentioned you, please feel free to chime in, or Ayad and Anu if you want to answer.
I would just say a quick thing, which is that, I think that the moral dimensions of the question, while very important, and I think, what Masha was suggesting, I think is true and philosophically profound and also provocative. There is the real politic dimension of it, which you allude to with regards to climate change. And so I don't have an answer to the question, but just to say that invariably we're going to be dealing with it, whether it's whether we approach it from a moral perspective or not. And we're going to, because the world is changing so much, and because there's going to be increasingly limited access to resources that people are going to be on the hunt for. So this is going to become a much more truculent, an even more truculent issue in the future, I suspect.
Yeah, and I'll just add, as someone who is thinking about very short term, right? How are we making life better for people today, while understanding, yeah, and totally agreeing that the whole system needs to be dismantled. I think too often we think in dichotomies, right? And Trump and Republicans, frankly, have this idea of family-based versus merit-based immigration, right? And then we all fall into this trap of talking about it as, should we have people be with their families, or do we want hard workers and people who can support us economically? As if those two things, one, are mutually exclusive, or two, the only categories or reasons that we should encounter in our immigration system or address in our immigration system. I think the other thing is that, yes, our immigration system is so outdated. 19 We're still living under rules created in 1965, and it's not right for the modern world. On the other hand, we have systems in place that are right now being exploited. So our humanitarian immigration system, we have rules around asylum and how people can apply for asylum and who should be granted asylum that are just completely being ignored, or worse, criminally, people are being excluded from being able to take advantage of the law as it currently stands. And so I think, it's again, it's like a both and. We need to think about dismantling the system, but we also need to think about, like, what's happening to people at the southern border right now, what's happening to people here who are waiting 20 years to bring loved ones over to reunite here. None of those things need to or should be happening, and we can address it right now. So, I think that the Biden bill takes one step towards that, but that there's so many other ways that we really need the president to act. I mean, President Trump demonstrated the vast expanse of executive authority in the field of immigration. Now it's time for us to really put that to the test, right? Like, let's get to it.
I would just add that I think that, thinking of the 1965 Act, that and our refugee law are both outdated. I mean, I do think that they should not violate the asylum laws right now. They should honor them. And I'm very disappointed that Biden is turning back people, asylum seekers, right now. He doesn't have to do that. I mean, the COVID thing's an excuse. He doesn't have to do that. But my larger point is that I think both asylum law or refugee law and the 1965 Immigration Act, those are both Cold War laws. Let's be clear, they're Cold War legislations. And they both have to be rethought. And it's easier for lawmakers somehow to tinker with the immigration system because they can argue about merit-based and family and the quotas and things like that. But I mean, the Biden bill says almost nothing about the asylum system, and the needs of people seeking refuge and asylum today don't fit the asylum system. They don't fit. So you have unaccompanied minors who come who say they're fleeing gangs in Central America, and the judges say, I'm sorry, youth is not a protected category, a persecuted category. So I think both of these larger legal regimes that regulate immigration and asylum, notwithstanding the bigger moral questions that we have to always keep in mind. But both those two regimes are totally out of date and need to be rethought in a much different kind of way. But I also think, as Ayad was saying, and John, I think it's a really huge challenge, because at the end of the day, I think the climate crisis means that the richer nations of the world are going to hoard their resources against the poor, and I think that's in some ways what Trump and other authoritarian regimes around the world are about. It's about hoarding resources for elites, and to really hoard them, you've got to get rid of democracy. So I think this is a big challenge for immigration and asylum law reform, but I think we need to think about those as systems of legal enforcement or rules. I think they're both completely inappropriate for us, our world today.
Thank you, Mae. And maybe just to put a cap on the evening, if anyone wants to pick up and answer in brief, we have maybe...
Sorry to end on a downer.
No, yeah, that's you know, maybe the reality we are contending with right now. But maybe this last question, if anyone wants to address it, will change the mood a little bit. It's from an anonymous attendee in regards to narrative, which we've been talking a lot about tonight. How can everyday people promote changing the status quo attitudes towards immigrants while being mindful of not taking advantage or exploiting their stories? If anyone wants to address that.
You know, those questions are always so difficult, because, you know, you imagine this like imaginary everyday person, like that person is not one of us. But of course, we're all, you know, regular everyday people, and we talk about immigration all the time, publicly and privately. And I think that for a start, you can be mindful of how, you know, of how you talk about it, right? And sort of the like the narratives that I was talking about earlier that I think we need to get rid of. And how can we talk and think about immigration in terms of human solidarity, in terms of humanity, rather than protection, right? And that sounds all very abstract, but it's actually something that, you know, that we do deal with every day. But also, and I'm, you know, I hope Anu has more specific suggestions, but immigrants are not, again, an abstraction, and they're not, so many immigrants are not at the southern border trying to get in. They're right here. And a lot of the time they need very specific, you know, very simple help. Like I interact a lot with LGBT asylum seekers, who, you know, who are no different from any other asylum seekers, in that they're in a new city. They need help getting their bearings. They need to know how to write a resume, or how to take the subway, or you know, they need a translator when they're putting together their documents. So if you speak a language, you can volunteer in some very simple ways. Sometimes people just need somebody to speak English with, because they don't know anybody who speaks English, right? There are actually so many very simple, real ways to help people, because we live in a city, you know, that is full of immigrants, many of them in very precarious positions, especially right now.
Yeah, just to go off of that, you know, New York, we're lucky. 1 in 4 New Yorkers is an immigrant. We have the most diverse immigrant community in the whole country, right? So, you know, there are a lot of resources that are needed, and especially for the last year, when we've seen the federal government, you know, shamefully exclude specifically undocumented workers and their families from every single relief effort, even as, you know, half of all essential workers in New York City are immigrants, a third in the state are immigrants, and they're just being left out of, you know, desperately needed relief. We see mutual aid, we see community-based organizations that are, you know, just doing basic services and always need more support. They always need more money, they need more volunteers, they need language help, they need all of it. And so You know, even in upstate, you know, New York finally passed driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants in 2019, but people just needed rides, right? Like, you know, it's not complicated, and you know, they need activism too, right? We saw an outpouring of support from people during family separation, right? 25,000 people came out of New York City. We needed all of those people to help us get driver's licenses in New York State, right? We needed them to be calling their members of the legislature, the governor, to make sure they understood that they had an impact on local policy. And so I think that there's, you know, a lot of really great ways that people can get engaged.
Thanks, Anu. And maybe that's a good place to end on a sort of a rallying cry. And before Zoom fatigue completely sets in. So just want to thank the panelists first and foremost for many thought-provoking ideas and for your time tonight. I really recommend to everyone who's here to read their work and you know, follow them. And want to thank, of course, both the Center for Brooklyn History and the New York Immigration Coalition for hosting this, and for everyone who's attended. And thanks so much. And you know, I would just second everything that Anu especially said, is people need to mobilize and you know, lean on each other and be supportive and you know, hold this new administration's feet to the fire. So thanks everybody, and good night.
Thank you.